Welcome back, listeners, to part 2 of our deep dive into the pressing issues of our time on AI Talk. I'm your host, Astro, and we're continuing our discussion with our guest, Robert Thompson. In our previous episode, Robert provided an in-depth critique of President Joe Biden's administration, arguing that it poses the greatest threat to democracy. Today, we're going to explore another dimension of this threat: media, censorship, and the erosion of democratic norms. Robert, thank you for joining us again.
It's great to be back, Astro. There's a lot to unpack here, and I'm eager to dive into it.
Let's start with the media. You've often criticized what you call mainstream media bias. Can you elaborate on how you believe media bias is affecting democracy under the current administration?
Absolutely, Astro. The role of the media in a democratic society cannot be overstated. It's supposed to act as a watchdog, holding those in power accountable. Unfortunately, what we're seeing today is a media landscape that is overwhelmingly biased in favor of the Democratic Party. And this bias is having a corrosive effect on our democracy. Take the 2020 presidential election as an example. Throughout the campaign, major news networks and social media platforms heavily censored negative information about Joe Biden, while amplifying unverified and often misleading stories about his opponent. The Hunter Biden laptop story is a prime case. Major outlets either ignored it or dismissed it as Russian disinformation without any substantial investigation. Later, when the veracity of the laptop was confirmed, it was too late. The damage was done. This selective reporting created a skewed narrative that undoubtedly influenced voter perceptions.
Supporters of these media outlets might argue that the press was merely acting responsibly by not spreading potentially false information. How do you respond to that?
The issue isn't just about what was or wasn't reported. It's about the consistent pattern of bias and the double standards that have become the norm. When it comes to conservatives, the media is quick to jump on any allegation, often without proper vetting, yet when it concerns Democrats, especially Biden, they apply a completely different standard. Look at the coverage of the January 6th Capitol riot compared to the coverage of the riots and protests during the summer of 2020. While the former was undoubtedly a significant and troubling event, the latter saw months of sustained violence, property destruction, and even loss of life, yet the media downplayed the severity of these incidents, often describing them as mostly peaceful protests. This kind of selective outrage and reporting undermines public trust in the media and erodes the very foundation of informed citizenry, essential for a functioning democracy.
You've also mentioned social media censorship. How does that fit into this picture?
Social media has become the primary source of information for many people, and the censorship by tech giants like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube is a serious threat to free speech and democratic discourse. Under the guise of combating misinformation, these platforms have systematically silenced conservative voices. Consider how Twitter and Facebook handled the Hunter Biden laptop story, blocking its dissemination and even suspending accounts that tried to share it, including major news outlets like the New York Post. This kind of censorship is not just about protecting users from false information, it's about controlling the narrative. Moreover, algorithms are designed to suppress conservative content while promoting liberal viewpoints. This was evident during the pandemic when dissenting opinions about COVID-19 origins, lockdowns, and vaccine mandates were often labeled as misinformation and removed, even when they were based on credible scientific debate. This suppression stifles free speech and undermines public trust in both the media and the platforms themselves.
Some argue that private companies have the right to enforce their own rules on their platforms. How would you address that argument?
While it's true that private companies have the right to enforce their own rules, the issue arises when these platforms become the de facto public square. The influence of social media giants is so vast that their actions can effectively silence significant portions of the population. When these companies suppress certain viewpoints, they aren't just enforcing their rules, they are shaping public discourse and influencing political outcomes. Moreover, the argument falls apart when you consider the collusion between these platforms and government officials. Recently, documents have emerged showing that members of the Biden administration have pressured social media companies to censor content that they deem problematic. This is a direct assault on the First Amendment rights of Americans. When the government, either directly or indirectly, uses private companies to censor speech, it's a clear violation of our constitutional principles.
That's a strong assertion, Robert. Can you provide specific examples of this collusion?
Certainly. One glaring example is the coordination between the White House and social media companies regarding COVID-19 information. Internal emails and meeting notes obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests have shown that the Biden administration held regular meetings with executives from Facebook, Twitter, and Google, pressuring them to crack down on what they labeled as misinformation. This included not just outright falsehoods, but also legitimate debates about the origins of COVID-19, the efficacy of lockdowns, and vaccine side effects. By coercing these platforms to remove or downrank content, the administration circumvented the First Amendment, effectively using these companies as proxies to enforce government censorship. Another example is the Department of Homeland Security's Disinformation Governance Board, which, although paused due to public backlash, was designed to coordinate efforts between the government and tech companies to combat misinformation. Such initiatives are deeply concerning because they blur the lines between government regulation and private enterprise, creating a dangerous precedent for state-sponsored censorship.
It seems like a complex issue. How do you propose we address the influence of these tech giants and their potential overreach?
The solution lies in a combination of regulatory reform and the promotion of alternative platforms. First, we need to update our antitrust laws to reflect the digital age. Companies like Google, Facebook, and Twitter wield enormous power, and their monopolistic practices stifle competition and innovation. Breaking up these tech giants would reduce their influence and create a more diverse and competitive marketplace of ideas. Second, we need to implement stronger protections for free speech online. This could include revising Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which currently gives these platforms broad immunity from liability while allowing them to censor content. Modifying this provision to hold companies accountable for viewpoint discrimination would help ensure a more balanced approach to content moderation. Finally, conservatives and free speech advocates must continue to support and develop alternative platforms that uphold the principles of free expression. We've seen the rise of platforms like Parler, Gab, and Rumble, which offer less restrictive environments for discourse. Encouraging the growth of these alternatives will provide a counterbalance to the current tech giants and foster a healthier, more diverse online ecosystem.
That's a comprehensive plan. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about another issue you've been vocal about: the erosion of democratic norms under Biden's administration. What are some specific examples you can provide?
The erosion of democratic norms is evident in several ways under Biden's administration. One of the most troubling examples is the ongoing efforts to federalize elections through legislation like the For the People Act, H.R. 1, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. These bills, if passed, would represent a significant federal overreach into how states conduct their elections, undermining the constitutional framework that grants states the primary responsibility for election administration. H.R. 1, for instance, proposes sweeping changes such as mandating same-day voter registration, universal mail-in ballots, and the elimination of voter ID requirements. These provisions, while framed as measures to increase voter access, actually open the door to significant vulnerabilities and potential fraud. The integrity of our elections is paramount, and these bills would undermine that by imposing a one-size-fits-all approach that disregards the unique needs and contexts of individual states.
Proponents of these bills argue that they are necessary to protect voting rights and ensure all Americans have equal access to the ballot. What's your take on that?
Ensuring equal access to the ballot is indeed crucial, but the measures proposed in these bills go far beyond that. They effectively strip states of their authority to conduct elections in a manner that ensures security and integrity. For example, eliminating voter ID requirements under the guise of increasing access is misguided. Voter ID laws are common-sense measures that help prevent fraud and ensure that each vote cast is legitimate. Most Americans support voter ID requirements, and studies have shown that these laws do not disenfranchise voters. Furthermore, universal mail-in voting as mandated by these bills has been shown to increase the potential for fraud and errors. Unlike absentee voting, which requires a request from the voter, universal mail-in voting involves sending ballots to every registered voter, regardless of whether they requested one. This can lead to ballots being sent to outdated addresses, deceased individuals, or individuals who are otherwise ineligible to vote. Such practices undermine public confidence in the electoral process.
You mentioned the federal overreach. How do you see this impacting the balance of power between state and federal governments?
The balance of power between state and federal governments is a cornerstone of our republic. The founders designed our system to prevent any one level of government from becoming too powerful. By federalizing elections, Biden and the Democrats are undermining this balance, concentrating more power in Washington, D.C., and reducing the ability of states to tailor their election systems to their specific needs. This centralization of power is not only unconstitutional but also impractical. States are laboratories of democracy, each with its unique challenges and demographics. A one-size-fits-all approach fails to account for this diversity and imposes a rigid framework that may not be suitable for all states. It also sets a dangerous precedent for future federal overreach into other areas traditionally managed by states.
In addition to election integrity, another area where you've expressed concern is the use of executive power. How do you view Biden's use of executive orders compared to previous administrations?
Biden's use of executive orders has been unprecedented in both volume and scope. Within his first few weeks in office, he signed dozens of executive orders, many of which reversed policies from the previous administration without any legislative process or public debate. This heavy reliance on executive orders is a troubling trend that bypasses Congress and undermines the separation of powers. For instance, Biden's executive order on climate change rejoined the Paris Agreement without consulting Congress, despite the significant economic and regulatory implications. Similarly, his executive orders on immigration and gun control have implemented sweeping changes that should have been subject to legislative scrutiny and debate. This approach not only alienates lawmakers from both parties, but also disenfranchises the American people by circumventing their elected representatives.
Critics might say that executive orders are necessary to address urgent issues, especially when Congress is gridlocked. How do you counter that argument?
While executive orders can be useful for addressing immediate and urgent issues, their overuse as a substitute for legislation is problematic. The founders designed our system of government with checks and balances precisely to prevent the concentration of power in any one branch. When a president relies excessively on executive orders, it disrupts this balance and erodes democratic norms. Congress may be gridlocked at times, but this gridlock is often a reflection of genuine policy disagreements among elected representatives. It's a feature of our democratic system, not a bug. Resorting to executive orders to bypass this process undermines the principle of representative democracy. Moreover, policies enacted through executive orders are less stable and more susceptible to being overturned by subsequent administrations, leading to policy uncertainty and instability.
Let's talk about another significant concern: the judicial system. How do you view Biden's impact on the judiciary?
Biden's impact on the judiciary is another area of deep concern. From the outset, his administration has sought to reshape the courts to align with a progressive agenda. This is evident in his judicial nominations, which have prioritized ideological conformity over qualifications and experience. The push to expand the Supreme Court, commonly referred to as court packing, is a particularly alarming development. While the administration has not yet formally pursued this, there have been vocal calls from within the Democratic Party to add more justices to the Supreme Court. This move would be an unprecedented and blatant attempt to shift the balance of the court in favor of the current administration's political agenda. Such an action would severely undermine the independence of the judiciary and erode public trust in the judicial system.
Court packing is indeed a contentious issue. What are the potential long-term consequences if such a measure were implemented?
If court packing were implemented, the consequences would be dire and far-reaching. First and foremost, it would destroy the principle of judicial independence. The judiciary is meant to be an impartial arbiter of the law, free from political influence. By increasing the number of justices to achieve a desired ideological outcome, the administration would be turning the Supreme Court into another partisan institution. This would lead to a tit-for-tat escalation. where future administrations, regardless of party, would be tempted to increase the number of justices whenever they are in power, further eroding the stability and integrity of the court. The result would be a judiciary that is perpetually in flux and viewed as an extension of the political branches rather than a co-equal and independent branch of government. Moreover, court packing would erode public trust in the judicial system. The American people need to believe that their courts are fair and impartial. If the Supreme Court is seen as merely a tool for advancing the political agenda of the party in power, public confidence in the rule of law will be severely undermined.
Beyond court packing, what other judicial issues concern you under the Biden administration?
Another significant concern is the administration's approach to law enforcement and criminal justice. Biden's policies and rhetoric have often aligned with the progressive movement to defund the police and reimagine public safety. This approach has contributed to a rise in crime rates in many major cities. As police departments are underfunded and demoralized, the administration's support for lenient bail policies, reduced sentencing for certain crimes, and the decriminalization of drug offenses has also led to a perception of lawlessness. While criminal justice reform is necessary, it must be balanced with the need to maintain public safety and uphold the rule of law. Biden's approach has tipped the scales too far in favor of leniency, compromising the safety and security of our communities.
Crime rates have been a significant issue in recent years. Can you provide specific examples of how Biden's policies have impacted crime rates?
Certainly. In cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, we've seen significant increases in violent crime, including homicides, assaults, and carjackings. For instance, in New York City, the number of shootings and murders surged in 2021 and 2022, reaching levels not seen in decades. This rise in crime can be directly linked to the policies and rhetoric coming from the administration and its allies in local governments. The push for bail reform, which aims to reduce the number of individuals held in pretrial detention, has led to repeat offenders being released back onto the streets, often within hours of their arrest. This revolving door of justice undermines the efforts of law enforcement and puts the public at risk. Moreover, the decriminalization of certain offenses, such as drug possession and theft under a certain amount, has emboldened criminals, knowing that they face little to no consequences for their actions.
You've highlighted a range of issues today. As we wrap up this segment, what steps do you think conservatives should take to address these concerns and safeguard democratic norms?
Conservatives must remain steadfast and proactive in their efforts to safeguard democratic norms. First, we need to continue advocating for election integrity measures that ensure every legal vote is counted and that the electoral process is secure. This includes supporting voter ID laws, opposing federal overreach in state election administration, and promoting transparency in the electoral process. Second, we must push back against censorship and bias in the media and on social media platforms. This involves advocating for regulatory reforms that hold tech giants accountable and supporting alternative platforms that uphold free speech principles. Additionally, conservatives should work to reclaim the narrative by creating and disseminating content that challenges the mainstream media's biased reporting. Third, we need to advocate for a balanced approach to criminal justice reform that prioritizes public safety while addressing genuine issues within the system. This means supporting law enforcement, opposing policies that undermine the rule of law, and promoting reforms that enhance community safety. Finally, it's crucial to remain engaged in the political process at all levels: local, state, and federal. This includes voting, participating in local government meetings, supporting candidates who uphold conservative values, and holding elected officials accountable. By taking these steps, conservatives can help ensure that our democratic norms are preserved and that our nation remains a beacon of freedom and justice.
Thank you, Robert, for sharing your insights and perspectives with us today. This concludes part 2 of our 3-part series. Join us next time as we continue this important discussion on AI Talk. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged.